One of the most horrifying and puzzling crimes in Canada's criminal history went unresolved for over half a century. The terrifying kidnapping of a youngster from the streets of Montreal was a wound that time could not heal. Many people lost faith of ever finding out the truth. But Sharron Prior's parents never gave up on getting the justice that had been denied to their daughter. Just lately, because to the painstaking commitment of a new generation of detectives. Propelled by improvements in forensic science and contemporary technology, this painful case was finally cracked. It was the month of March in 1975. The bitter frost of a late winter evening still clung. To the air in Point St. Charles, Sharon Prior was only 16 years old. Yet she was full of life and on the verge of everything. She was having a nice evening hanging out with friends at a local youth center. It was the type of casual freedom that made the neighborhood what it was. But the distance between the center and her house, only a few blocks, was going to become an enormous chasm. Irene, her mother, felt the first small twinge of worry when the clock hands moved past the time they had agreed on. Every parent understands that instant calculation, late or missing. The second she walked onto the porch and saw the dark, deserted streets stretched out before her, the question was answered with a sickening surety. The Prior family lived in a world where doors were unlocked and children strolled home after dark without a second thought. That was the peaceful agreement of the neighborhood, a pledge of safety suddenly and forcefully rejected. Sharon was expected to be home, snuggled up, recalling the evening's trivialities. But as Irene walked the floor, the quiet in the home began to feel huge, an echoing canyon. The phone rang, but it was never Sharon. Every passing minute added weight to the worry, changing the normal comfort of their house into a prison of anguish. Where could a 16-year-old girl suddenly vanish in the span of 3 blocks? The reasoning failed, the mind raced through prosaic possibilities, spontaneous diversion. A discussion lasting long, but the deepest, most fundamental instinct screamed a warning that could not be ignored. Irene recalled the coat, the colorful new coat Sharon had been wearing, a feature so little, yet suddenly so crucial. It was too chilly to remain outside without it for long. This was not a runaway. This was an impossible rendered terrifyingly real. When the police eventually came, the first formality of their questioning seemed almost absurd against the panic growing inside the family's chest. They cataloged the fact site, last seen, clothing reducing a colorful existence to a bare checklist of missing descriptions. The inquiries seemed like an invasion, yet they were the only lifeline. The Priors had entered a chilly, claustrophobic new reality, one characterized by the one dreadful word that hung unsaid between them and the officers. Abducted. The search began as a confined effort, a frenzied, chaotic scan of known streets and lanes. Neighbors, motivated by terror, joined the family in traversing the freezing street, shouting out her name, their voices weak against the darkness. Each shadowy nook offered the possibility for a clue, or worse, a confirmation of the unknown fear. The Priors clung to the frenzied energy of the initial hunt, knowing that silence meant surrender to the prospect they could not endure. They searched the youth center again, questioned every merchant, every household along Sharon's route, their appeals developing into a public, sad vigil. Did you see her? The persistent denial, the shrugs, the blank looks, each one chipped away at the optimism they were urgently trying to retain. The hours flowed into a scary odiate. Sleep became an adversary, a temporary relief from the need to remain vigilant, to receive the call, to check the door. The police enlarged their search perimeter, the maps now including the whole city, no longer just the nearby area. The case was upped, the stakes rose, but the core problem remained, a complete paucity of information. The media descended, flashing lights and worried voices, intensifying the family's suffering, turning their private dread into a public spectacle. Irene could only retell the specifics of that final sighting, the way Sharon had waved, the naive expectancy of her return. She was just going home, she muttered to the reporters, the simplicity of the sentence accentuating the horrific injustice of what had occurred. 3 days after the disappearance, the worst fears of the Prior family were cruelly realized. The site of the find, a highly forested area in Montreal, miles from Point St. Charles, blew away any remaining idea that Sharon may just stroll back through the door. The sight of the police tape and the grim faces of the investigating policemen was an immediate, visceral punch of confirmation. A missing person case had curdled into a homicide inquiry, a distinction marked by a profound and irrevocable finality. The news came like a physical blow, destroying the delicate serenity the family had managed to create. The facts of the crime, kept from public view by the authorities, formed a picture of premeditated savagery that, beyond explanation, who would do such heinous crime on a young, innocent girl? The attention moved from "where is she?" to "who did this?" The investigation was immediately rigorous, forensic professionals crawling over the area, searching the microscopic signs that would indicate toward the offender. A city that had gathered in optimism now recoiled in terror. The shadow of the killer had passed over Montreal, leaving the people not simply grieving, but terribly unnerved by the sense of a predator roaming among them. Sharon was returned to her family, not in person, but as a file, a tragedy, and a promise of justice that felt impossibly distant. The immediate, frenzied intensity of the police probe ultimately began to subside. Detectives pursued every trail, interviewed numerous possible witnesses, and cobbled together a timeline that ended suddenly and fatally. But the route turned frigid with a pace that was discouraging and alarming. The suspect remained elusive, a ghost in the machine of the metropolis. There was no apparent motivation, no evident link, no smoking gun that could quickly identify the individual guilty for the deed. The evidence, albeit collected methodically, gave only pieces. As the weeks progressed into months, the first rush of tips tapered to a trickle, then ceased completely. The case was examined, reevaluated, and finally consigned to a position deep inside the cold case files. For the Prior family, however, the case stayed alive, a festering wound that refused to shut. They lived in a continual state of alert. Every stranger on the street, a potential suspect. Every news story of an arrest, a temporary rush of false optimism. The quiet from the investigators was nearly as loud as the pain. They had sought answers, but received only the loud echo of an unsolved atrocity. The name of their daughter, once linked with a bright future, was now connected forever to the tragedy of an unknown killer. The calendar pages flipped, reflecting not time's passage, but the duration of their excruciating wait. 3 days after the disappearance, the worst fears of the Prior family were cruelly realized. The site of the find, a highly forested area in Montreal, miles from Point St. Charles, blew away any remaining idea that Sharon may just stroll back through the door. The sight of the police tape and the grim faces of the investigating policemen was an immediate, visceral punch of confirmation. A missing person case had curdled into a homicide inquiry, a distinction marked by a profound and irrevocable finality. The news came like a physical blow, destroying the delicate serenity the family had managed to create. The facts of the crime, kept from public view by the authorities, formed a picture of premeditated savagery that, beyond explanation, who would do such heinous crime on a young, innocent girl? The attention moved from "where is she?" to "who did this?" The investigation was immediately rigorous, forensic professionals crawling over the area, searching the microscopic signs that would indicate toward the offender. A city that had gathered in optimism now recoiled in terror. The shadow of the killer had passed over Montreal, leaving the people not simply grieving, but terribly unnerved by the sense of a predator roaming among them. Sharon was returned to her family, not in person, but as a file, a tragedy, and a promise of justice that felt impossibly distant. The immediate, frenzied intensity of the police probe ultimately began to subside. Detectives pursued every trail, interviewed numerous possible witnesses, and cobbled together a timeline that ended suddenly and fatally. But the route turned frigid with a pace that was discouraging and alarming. The suspect remained elusive, a ghost in the machine of the metropolis. There was no apparent motivation, no evident link, no smoking gun that could quickly identify the individual guilty for the deed. The evidence, albeit collected methodically, gave only pieces. As the weeks progressed into months, the first rush of tips tapered to a trickle, then ceased completely. The case was examined, reevaluated, and finally consigned to a position deep inside the cold case files. For the Prior family, however, the case stayed alive, a festering wound that refused to shut. They lived in a continual state of alert. Every stranger on the street, a potential suspect. Every news story of an arrest, a temporary rush of false optimism. The quiet from the investigators was nearly as loud as the pain. They had sought answers, but received only the loud echo of an unsolved atrocity. The name of their daughter, once linked with a bright future, was now connected forever to the tragedy of an unknown killer. The calendar pages flipped, reflecting not time's passage, but the duration of their excruciating wait. Decades passed. The 70s gave way to the 80s, and they to the millennium. But the anxiety and the unsolved anguish stayed set in 1975 for the Prior family. Sharon's parents, Irene and George, refused to let the case get eaten by the archives. Their effort was no longer a frenetic hunt. It became a slow, tireless campaign of memory. They joined in every annual appeal, every fresh media push, their features marked with the tiredness of a decades-long load. Their endurance was a monument to the enduring quality of a parent's love. A beacon flashing into the cold file cabinet of the inquiry, the detectives who had worked the initial case retired. The streets of Point St. Charles altered. But the little box of evidence, the few remaining artifacts, and the original case file stayed put. Sharron Prior became one of Quebec's most enduring and devastating cold cases. The perpetrator, if they were still alive, had managed to elude arrest, living a life characterized by the horrible secret they bore. The injustice was not simply the act itself, but the silent, excruciating win of the criminal against the system. The Priors had raised their other children, lived their lives, but always with the asterisk of Sharon's absence, an ever-present reminder of the resolution that was always out of grasp. "How do you forget?" Irene was regularly asked. "You don't," she would say. "You just learn to live alongside the shadow." By the 2000s, the landscape of criminal investigation had been radically altered by science. The advent of DNA analysis and subsequently genetic genealogy presented a promise that had been inconceivable in 1975, the prospect of retrieving an identity from the most minuscule bits of evidence. Sharron Prior's case was one of the numerous cold files dusted out and evaluated through this new, forceful lens. The material collected so methodically, although fruitlessly, by the first team now held a possible secret. Detectives, specializing in historical cases, concentrated on the limited biological evidence preserved from the scene. They were little deteriorated and fragile, a remnant of the past, waiting for the technology of the future. The initial DNA profile they managed to build was a significant step. However, it provided no quick match in the National Criminal Database. The murderer had never been registered into the system. This was the point that the technique switched, going from simple database matching to the groundbreaking use of genetic genealogy. The premise was simple but profound. Utilize the perpetrator's DNA to discover their distant relatives who had freely donated their information to public DNA databases. A little undetected link might lead across an entire family tree. It was a tiny gleam, a whisper of a possibility over 40 years of quiet. The difficult, painstaking process of genetic genealogy began. Forensic scientists and police collaborated with genealogy experts, establishing a wide family tree based on the DNA profile of the unknown assailant. They followed relationships across generations, across continents, steadily limiting the options. Every leaf on the tree was a person, every branch a connection, until the complicated web began to collapse into a single vital suspect. His name was Franklin Maywood. Maywood was a name unknown to the Prior family and the first investigation. He had lived a life of relative obscurity, living in the U.S. after the crime, his history buried under the peaceful facade of normalcy. He had been close to Montreal in the 1970s, a ghostly presence on the fringe of the inquiry that had concentrated on others. The perspective of the case temporarily pivots to the shadow he inhabited. His life had been lived with the knowing, the horrible, stifling secret he held. Every knock on the door, every flashing police car, every news item on cold cases must have been a spike of panic, a persistent, low-frequency hum of anxiety under the regularity of his days. He had moved on, possibly assuming the obscurity of time was his shield, that the secrets of 1975 were secure. But science had reached across the decades, his own biological identity becoming the witness against him. With the genealogy lead established, the inquiry began its final painstaking phase. It was no longer a historical cold case. It was an active chase. The aim was now to confirm the relationship between Maywood and the crime beyond any question. The investigators drove south, studying the suspect. gathering the essential evidence in a manner that was meticulous, discreet, and completely accurate. They needed a sample of his DNA abandoned coffee cup, a napkin, something that retained the biological characteristic that might corroborate the decades-old profile. The anxiety was enormous. One misstep could alert him, sending the final frail dream of closure tumbling down. The waiting was terrible, both for the detectives and for the Prior family, who were kept informed with guarded optimism. After 47 years, they were closer than they had ever been to putting a face to the monster. Finally, a sample was successfully acquired. The clock started ticking while it was flown back, processed, and studied. The instant the proof came a flawless, undeniable match between the DNA on the cold case file and the guy named Franklin Maywood, the almost half-century wall of quiet finally shattered. The arrest was accomplished discreetly, efficiently, bringing an abrupt, stunning conclusion to a life spent in secrecy. The truth was finally in hand. The interrogation chamber was a sterile, austere setting, a sharp contrast to the decades of disguised intricacy. Faced with the indisputable proof of his own DNA, the weight of the secret Maywood had carried eventually became too great to bear. The wall he had created around the events of 1975 began to break. The confession was confused, disjointed, a disturbing view into a mind that had spent nearly 50 years attempting to repress the unspeakable. "I didn't mean just driving the rain." The words were murmured, evasive, yet they progressively painted the awful shape of that March evening. The information, scarce and raw, corroborated the timing and the place, verifying the laborious effort of generations of detectives. The recollection was clear, yet the awareness of the harm inflicted felt remote, a defensive mechanism still stubbornly clinging to the surface. He acknowledged to the panic, the instant escape, and the freezing. Icy determination to simply carry on with his life, as if the occurrence had been wiped by the passage of time. She was just walking. ... I panicked. I simply continued driving. The confession was not an apology. It was an admission of reality necessitated by science. But for the Prior family, hearing the name, hearing the how, and the who after so long, was a dreadful type of relief. The creature now had a face. The shadow was named the conclusion, albeit long awaited, came with a severe cost. The apprehension of Franklin Maywood did not bring Sharon back, nor did it erase the 47 years of terrible uncertainty that her parents had experienced. The relief was instantly mixed with the anguish of what had been lost, the milestones missed, the life unlived, the continual, exhausting psychological toll of an unsolved crime. How can you calculate the price of time stolen by a secret? It is measured in the restless nights, the anniversary tears, and the silent unwillingness to put away the memories of a 16-year-old girl. Irene and George Prior, having struggled for so long, were finally able to rest their vigil. But the conclusion also brought new pain-the-public recitation of the awful facts. The exposing of the horror one final time. This final chapter was not about healing. It was about the cold, brutal administration of justice. The procedure compelled them to relive the night their world was cleft in two. But this time, they did it with the knowledge that the perpetrator would eventually be called to account. The case had become a tribute to the lasting strength of familial love, a quiet, profound reluctance to allow a victim be forgotten. The judicial hearings that followed the arrest were the final formal chapter of the tragedy. Franklin Maywood finally pled guilty to manslaughter, a legal compromise that ensured a final conviction and saved the Prior family the pain of a prolonged trial. The judicial conclusion, however, unsatisfactory in the view of many, gave a definite end to the decades of conjecture and agony. He was convicted, his freedom finally destroyed. A result that occurred almost 5 decades too late for Sharon, but just on time for justice. The significance of Sharron Prior's case stretches beyond the courtroom. It became a remarkable monument to the requirement of tenacity and the transforming potential of forensic science. It served as a historic example for cold case units across Canada, indicating that no matter how damaged the evidence and no matter how lengthy the passage of time, the truth could still be uncovered. Her memory is now maintained not only in the hearts of her family, but in the procedures of justice itself. Sharron Prior was a victim of a horrible deed, but with the steadfast efforts of her parents and the innovations of contemporary technology, she ultimately found her voice, delivering a long overdue sentence that rang across almost half a century of stillness. The darkness was broken. The truth, at last, was exposed.